Hi guys and welcome back. Today we are talking about Rega Brio amp. And this small amp is basically a good old integrated amp. It doesn't have any sort of digital inputs, so no digital section on board. It's just an analog amplification section, good old class AB design, with like reasonable amounts of power. So in the back you can find several line inputs, phono input, and record output. As I said, classic, good old integrated. One thing that I wanted to mention is when it comes to speaker binding posts, you can use banana plugs, you can use spades, supposedly, and bare wire. But I noticed something. This upper and lower part of the chassis that actually protrudes and leans over and under binding posts prevented me to use spades. Everything else on the left and right is also very cramped. Line outputs really close on one side, then power inlet really close on the other side. So even though these look like you can use spades, there is actually no way of using spades. So you're left with bare wire or banana plugs. If I'm wrong and you think the spades can be used on this one, please write down below in the comments and feel free to correct me, that's okay. In front, there's nothing much to talk really. There's a power button, input selector, and volume control. You also do get a remote control for this. Integrated, it's small and plasticky, but it does the job. But let's talk about how Rega Brio actually sounds. Well, it sounds interesting. And why I say this? Because it sounds warm and lush and full, especially in a mid-range centric way. Why is that interesting, you may ask? Well, because most of the amps I encounter these days do not sound like that. When I was a kid, when I started buying my first hi-fi gear in early 2000s, and even before that, when I listened to hi-fi at my neighbors' places, etc., having a warm and full sounding gear was not that uncommon. But nowadays, everything shifted towards being more resolving, having more high frequencies, retrieving more high frequency details, and simply sounding much more neutral. And if a hi-fi component does not sound neutral, it's usually shifting towards brightness and being a little bit more analytical more often than the opposite happens. And because of that, when I talk about system matching, and for example, a friend asks me, like, I have this deck, I like it, it's very detailed, but it's kinda bright and analytical sounding. What sort of amp should I buy to match it? And I often default to NAD, Class AB NADs. Even some newer Class D NADs sound very full and warm. But there is a catch with that. Those NADs often really irreversibly eat some of the details and some of the information from that source and from the recording. Finding a good warm sounding amp these days, it's not an easy thing to do. And Rega Brio is just that. It has upper bass emphasis and it has mid-range emphasis. And because of that, it sounds really full and lush in the mid-range. That goes for vocals and for instruments. But it also sounds quite clean and resolving the way that more affordable NADs simply cannot compare. They would obscure much more details than this Rega. So if you're after this kind of warmer sounding amp that sounds a little bit rolled off up top, but still has pretty clean sound and clear sound, just with emphasized mid-range and mid-bass, this might be a really good choice. So while I was testing this one, I had also a pair of triangle Borea O3 speakers here at my place. And I noticed that those sound absolutely great and dynamic and resolving, but they are a little bit bright and peaky up top. And when paired to like a really common nowadays amp, like SMSL class Ds that I like and I reviewed a lot of them on this channel, that sounds peaky and bright. When paired with like really good amplifier, Atoll IN100 that I also recently reviewed, that sound peaky and bright. But Rega Brio here was just a right measure to make these tamer and just more pleasant to my ears, while at the same time not actually losing clarity. It's not melting tones together. There's a decent separation. There's a decent sense of empty space between tones and between instruments. Now, talking about that, the sound staging on Rega, in my opinion, is a little bit forward. It's mid-range forward, and that also pushes lots of instruments and vocals to sound like they're right there in between your speakers, close to you. If you want something that has like a really deep sound stage and a really dark background that can pinpoint everything with great precision, this is not really that amp. But instead it does sound really present and palpable. Instead of transporting you to another space that you feel that recording is coming from another virtual space in your room, it actually brings the instruments and vocals and every tone in your room. It's like there. And it's doing that in a fairly clean manner. It also has quite a bit of energetic and upbeat sound to it. As long as you pair it with a reasonably sensitive speakers, because this one does not have much power. So if you have like a really low sensitivity speakers, it will probably feel a little bit strained. So when I mixed it with my Spirit Winds that are 85 dB sensitive, I felt that control of the bass line was lacking a little bit. I could still get really loud. I could get decent sound quality from it, but if cranked a little bit and pushed harder, this amp can lose focus a little bit and it can lose control over that juicy mid bass that is otherwise a good trait in my opinion. It sounds really nice, but with low sensitivity speakers, when pushed hard, it can sound a little bit overbearing and uncontrolled. But pair it well with reasonably sensitive speakers, like mentioned triangles that are 90 dB, or maybe Klipsch RP600M, something along those lines. This will bring a lot of rhythmic, engaging, dynamic sound. And it will sound really, really well without inducing any harshness or brightness or that just modern analytical sound. So here, when we talk about that pairing, I have one more thing that I wanted to say. If your hi-fi system placement is such that your speakers are really close to the walls or to the corners of your room, that bass and mid bass might be already emphasized quite a bit. And in those situations, if you feel like your system is struggling with bloaty bass, Rega Brio might not be a good choice. It will probably only emphasize that problem and put out so much mid bass that it will warm up the whole mid-range and suffocate, drown highs. Just too dark and too warm. But if you keep your speakers a little bit further away from the walls and corners, like I'm doing for example, this tonality can actually be very enjoyable. And I'm still going to talk a little bit about pairing. For example, I feel that monitor audio speakers, they're really resolving, but they never sounded neutral to my ears. They were always more high frequency oriented. like lean sounding. So I had a friend bring his monitor Audio Bronze 2, and those sounded really good and full and positively juicy with Rega Brio, the way that these speakers cannot sound with most modern amps. Because if you pair like neutral analytical linear sounding gear with neutral analytical linear sounding speaker, that's all just lean and analytical. And there are a lot of speakers out there that share similar sound signature to those monitor audios. Not completely the same, but along those same lines. For example, a lot of focal speakers are really bright sounding. And I haven't had a chance to try that pairing, but I suspect that Rega Brio with an average focal speaker would be a really good match. Might be a really good match. So let's move to a few quick comparisons. First one among them is Atoll IN100. That's a more powerful, more authoritative sounding amp, and if you have less sensitive speakers, it will be able to move them a little bit better than Rega Brio. And it will do that with more composure, keeping layering and separation and baseline control better than Rega Brio. In terms of liveliness and dynamics, those two are quite similar, but tonally they're also quite different. Whereas Atoll just emphasizes those upper registers and have that upper mid-range presence. It can sound a little bit aggressive if not paired well. Rega Brio is the complete opposite in my opinion. It's mellow and softer sounding. It's fuller and juicier sounding, not as well controlled and not as detailed as Atoll IN100, but it's more jolly sounding. And if you do not compare them directly, you really might not notice the lack of those tiny details that Atoll can provide and Rega Brio does not really. Because on its own, Brio still sounds very clean and quite resolving. So my next comparison would be with NAD D3020 V2. I chose this one because it's almost half the price, something like that, half the price, and it also has a really full, warm and lush sound signature. But that NAD, as described earlier, simply cannot resolve and cannot make nearly as clean sounding tones as Rega Brio. This one is just overall cleaner sounding. It separates better, it has cleaner, more empty background compared to NAD that just melts almost all sounds in one big, fuzzy, warm sound stage that's just congested together, and it's hard to differentiate anything inside of it. Of course, if we are speaking about leading vocal and then an instrument that's far left or far right, you can differentiate that. But small nuances and like space around the instruments, reverbs, echoes in the room, in the recording space, or maybe just added in post-production, you can hardly observe any of that through NAD. But you can clearly hear much more of that with something like Rega Brio here. Even though it does have the basically same warm tonality, it's just doing it on a higher level. It still separates and arranges tones better and in a cleaner and a darker background than NAD can. And then lastly, if I compare it to something really affordable but good, something that's actually better than that NAD, like SMSL DA9 or A300, those are really resolving neutral sounding amplifiers. I would say that in terms of just detail retrieval, those are roughly comparable to this Rega Brio. And if you're looking strictly from that point, how much details you can dig out of the recording, you might say that this amp is not really worth it compared to the SMSLs. That said, SMSLs do sound neutral and slightly lean, and their sound stages are more pushed back, not as big and as expensive and in your room as Rega Brio here is doing. Also, when we talk about dynamics, Rega Brio feel like it's jumpier, more jolly, more party ready than these SMSLs. It just brings music to sound more alive and more like you're in a club and there are big instruments in your room than these leaner, slightly flatter sounding SMSLs can. Is that actually worth the difference? Well, I don't know, it's up to you to decide, but what I can tell you is that this blend of full and warm sound that's still clean enough and resolving enough and separated enough is not that easily found. So a lot of these affordable Chinese Class D amps can match its detail retrieval, maybe even surpass it, some of them, but they cannot match that tone and that fullness of the mid-range. If you're not into that, that's perfectly fine. But if you're looking for that, if you think that your system lacks that, if you have leaner sounding sources and speakers and you actually look to counter that with the amp, I personally haven't heard any more affordable amp so far having this tonality and doing it this well. So I think that alone is worth something and actually worth considering this amp when thinking about a new integrated up to 1,000 euros. With that, I just wanted to mention one thing before I end this video today, is that while this unit was with me while I was testing it, one channel started to misbehave. Just one channel would be heard. Sometimes when I turn it on, it would be okay. Sometimes it wouldn't. And sometimes I would hear both channels, but in a weird way. Everything would sound far away and low in volume, like clearly not functioning as it should. And quick Googling revealed that that's not all that uncommon with these Brio amps. It happens. Fortunately, this unit still has a warranty, and its owner already contacted the distributor. They said like, oh yeah, we know about that, just bring it back to us, we'll sort it out. That's great. That's one great thing about buying gear from a local distributor. But that aside, to my ears, this Rega Brio is a really nice sounding amp. It's not a champion in how it resolves details or how big sound stage it can develop or how well it controls less sensitive speakers, but I believe that it occupies a really important niche, and that is that it's a warm, mid-range centric, mid-range lush sounding amp that's still very clean and resolving sounding and lively sounding. And it does that better than many other warm sounding amps that I've heard, especially like more affordable ones. So if you are after that type of sound, after that type of tonality, but you do not want to sacrifice too much of other traits, like you would with NAD, for example, this is a pretty good choice in my opinion. And with that, and thanks to the owner for loaning this one for a review, it's time to end this video. So thank you again for watching, comment, like, subscribe. See you next time. Bye.